Well, hello there. We're a week early for the final exam review. Ordinarily, we would be talking about the final exam during the week that the final exam begins. But since next week is Memorial Day weekend and there is no school, we're a week early. But if you are watching this in the future, you'll know that you'll still be able to see it during that week. So let's just go ahead and jump in and find out what we're going to do on the final exam. So the final exam is 1 week only, as just like it's the same format that we used for the midterm. And it is June 2nd through June 9th. And it's in the same place. It's in the testing center, which is in the room 311 of the center building. The exam closes Thursday, and that's important because it is during final exam week, and the testing center closes early that night, that day. It closes at 5 o'clock. So keep that in mind, because you're not going to be able to get in there late. So just keep that in mind, that you got to be out of there by 5 o'clock. There will be no makeup exams, so don't bother me with that request. Do check for Saturday hours if they have it available. I urge you to go during the Saturday time. And also, the exam is the format again is the same as it was during the midterm. So if you took the midterm, you knew what was on it, you're going to have the same kind of format. So nothing's changed like that. Now, the study guides are now available on Moodle. They're available for you to look. And for the final exam, I think you're going to like this study guide. I think it'll be something that you'll really appreciate. And so I'll just say in advance, you're welcome. Okay. Again, it's in the testing lab. Already mentioned that. And remember that you need these things. I mean, if you got through the midterm, you're going to be able to get through the final if you just do as they say. And, just follow the center's rules and requirements. So, okay, moving on. Talk about the extra credit. Extra credit is due on June 7th. So that's not next week, it's in 2 weeks. And the extra credit, if you're going to mail it, which most people don't, but if you're going to mail it, it's got to be postmarked no later than June 3rd. So the way that works for your extra credit, if you're turning in a hard copy at my office by 10:30 a.m., and also get it to me by that time by email, which is the way most of you do it anyway. You send me as an attachment. And so anyway, that's when it's due. So, all right, we move on. So what is it all about? What are we going to cover? Well, it is going to cover everything from midterm through next week. So it is the combat film through what our video series calls The Edge of Hollywood, which includes the film school generation and all these other things. So let's just get started and take a look at what is meant by the combat war film. Our video series gave us these features, these important concepts. They maintain that the combat war film for Hollywood gives us laws and morality that get suspended. There is a switch from the individual to the group, and that's a significant part because so much, thanks mainly to the iconography. Now, when we say iconography here, we're also, we're one of the things that we talk about with regard to film iconography are the performers. And many of these people who performed in Westerns also performed in war films. And the most obvious example of that, John Wayne. So what's significant here is that in the Western, there has always been an emphasis on the individual, on the loner, on the, the guy that rides into town all by his lonesome. You know, even titles have that in it, like Ride Lonesome with Randolph Scott. But when we switch over to the war film, it's no longer the individual that's important, but instead it's the group, it's the troops. Everybody works for the good of the order and works in a team. The third part is that women serve as an emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. In many respects, because it's a Hollywood film, you have to have some kind of romance, and you have to have some kind of feminine side in the film. And as they always said, the reason for that is because they want to get women to come in and see the films as well. So, you know, if you're talking about a war movie in World War II, women were not in combat, and it would be mostly just all men out there killing each other. But they bring in a woman, and part of her job in that is that she takes the male and gets rid of all of that macho testosterone kind of thing that happens in the male group, and brings in this vulnerability to it. I always think the perfect example of this is a film that John Wayne was in the late 40s, 49 actually, called The Sands of Iwo Jima. And he's the tough as nails leader of his Marine squad, and he has absolutely no emotions whatever, and it's all for the good of the order, and he treats some of those guys rotten and all of that kind of stuff. But there is a scene where he runs into a woman in a bar, you know, for 1949 under the censorship thing, but we know what she's there for and what he's there for, but she's also there to make money to feed her child, and so all of a sudden John Wayne melts and all of that. So, you know, that's kind of how that works in the combat war film. Moving on, they mentioned the anti-war sentiments in post-war films. We'll talk about the Office of War Information in a minute, but during the films that were made during the war, they're very much pro-war, if you could call it that. That is, they are pro-allies. You know, we've got to win the war. We've got to do it, or else, you know, nobody wants to live under Nazi rule, kind of a thing. So they push that idea. Once the war is over and once we are victors, then we get more films that begin to talk about anti-war sentiments, and it's more like quite a bit of difference in anti-war sentiments at that time versus what you'd see in the 60s type films. But anyway, there's this idea of the futility of war and the loss of life, that sort of thing. There's a very excellent little British film that was made in the 50s about their assignment is to go and take this hill, and they get slaughtered. I mean, there's only about 2 people that survive it, and once they get the hill, and once they have survived, then the people in charge, the generals and all of that, say, well, you know, that hill wasn't all that important anyway, so forget about it. You know, those kinds of things. War films and the portrayal of racial integration of armed forces. There was segregation in World War II. It was Truman in 1947 or 48 that finally integrated the Army and all the other branches of service. And all of that gets touched in our discussion, our film discussion. And the fundamental American philosophy or ideology that's embedded in American war films is simply this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So the whole point is, yeah, we may win a few battles, we may lose a lot of battles, but the point is we are right in what we are doing. Okay, now to the Office of War Information. Now this is a propaganda machine. This was the role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production. It was simply shaping public opinion. It got everyone to be supportive of it, and the film industry participated in that. It's always amazing to buy war bonds. Our film series mentioned war bonds, but you know, you buy Hollywood stars were out there selling these war bonds. And nobody sold more war bonds than Abbott and Costello, the comedy team. They were out constantly, out there performing and selling these war bonds. So, but anyway, the Office of War Information is the propaganda machine. They were shaping public opinion. And usually it is the way that the Hollywood film people made this kind of a reason, you know, it's worth the effort, is what they called the Sergeant York formula, which was a biography of Sergeant York that was made by Warner Brothers in the 40s. He was a conscientious objector. He did not want to go to war. He was opposed to war. But once he got into it and he saw the threat to freedom and that sort of thing, then he became a great supporter of the war. And so that was kind of basically the outline that we had here, that, yeah, nobody wants to go to war, especially the soldier. They always said the guy that is more for peace than anybody is a soldier. But nobody wants to go to war, but once you get into it and once you're in the middle of all of this horrible stuff that's going on, the best thing to do is get it over with. And so anyway, that was the Sergeant York formula. And interestingly, of course, there was the anti-war era of the 1960s. There was lots of films out there just talking about the futility of war. But nonetheless, the American people are in the middle of a war in Vietnam, and so John Wayne produces a film to support the American troops. He calls it The Green Berets. And of all things, he just defaults back to the 1940s theme of the Sergeant York formula, in which you have one person in there that is opposed to the war until he gets right in the middle of it, and then he changes and realizes that I have been wrong and I need to support them. Okay, that's the Office of War Information, and then we move to a film genre, as it were, that occurs right after the war. And it is known as film noir. The question that our video series asks, and the book as well, as anybody that's involved in film, is it really a true genre? Is it really something that is a type, or is it just simply a style? That's the question. Because if we talk about these films and we see the style that's involved, we see other films that also have the same style. Citizen Kane, for example, has a film noir style to it. But is Citizen Kane film noir? I would say no. So anyway, that's the question, and there's no answer. I mean, we all fall into a camp and say, yeah, it is a genre, or some people just still say, no, it isn't. It's just a style of filmmaking. But it's a French word, a French phrase there, film noir, which means black film, which means that it's a dark and foreboding kind of image to it. They were adaptations of American pulp fiction and hard-boiled novels. They were becoming popular at this time, late 1930s, and certainly into the 40s. There were just a plethora of books about the hard-boiled detective, and we'll talk about him in a moment. But these films, nobody really called them film noir until they were discovered in post-war France. Now, that's our relationship with the journal Cahiers du Cinéma. It is these young filmmakers wannabe, who are enamored of American films. They finally get a chance to see films because the war is over, and they're seeing American films, and they look at it and they discover, my gosh, there's a certain kind of movie out there that's very interesting, stylistically especially. They look at it and they see it stylistically with all of that wonderful chiaroscuro lighting effects, and they start talking about it, and they just come up with a name for it. They just describe it as film noir. So that's where we get this, but it is not something that was made at the time. We don't have Billy Wilder and Roy William Neill and a lot of these guys making these films say, I'm going to make a film noir. They're just going to make a film based on these novels and these characters, and they end up with this thing. And so what is it that they end up with? Well, what we see is one of the important things about a film noir is its setting. It's always urban. It's right smack dab in the middle of the city. It's not even a town. It's smack dab in the middle of a city. It is very urban. It is in the inner city. They film it within, certainly with dark, the chiaroscuro lighting effects and everything, because it's mostly, I have yet to find, well, I won't say that, because I think there are, but the point is that they filmed it at night. It's always at night. When you go into a film noir world, there is no daylight. And it's rain-slick streets. Beautiful images can be created with that. And it's really, when you're in the city, it's the sleazy side of city life. This is, the Chamber of Commerce would not make a movie like this. This is a sleazy side. It's a dangerous side of life. And that brings us then to the themes and the characters that are involved in this. We'll take a look at the characters first, because what you have, the character is usually a private detective. This is different from what we've had in Hollywood films, because often, many of the earlier films, we have police departments. You actually have the sworn officers working. But this is a private detective who is an antisocial loner. Sam Spade epitomizes this kind of character. And often in the film, somewhere in that film, is someone who doesn't quite know what's happened. And so amnesiacs are very crucial to reversals in plot. So those are the character types. As such, they're kind of adrift in this alienated world. They are alienated from everything and everybody. The wonderful little movie called Detour is perfect for this, because it opens on a guy just in a cafe by himself wondering what happened. He's alienated from everything. And also it gives us this sense of no exit. It's the existential world. Once you're trapped in that city, that sleazy side of the city, there's no escape. You're doomed. The film style, we've already kind of mentioned that. It's lots of low-key lighting. There are lots of shadowy elements in it. That's that chiaroscuro effect of lighting with harsh shadows, harsh light, harsh dark. There are often strange highlights. I always get that title confused, but there's that wonderful, one of the film noir films I always remember seeing is that just about every character, half the face was in a shadow. Sometimes it was split right down the middle, left and right, kind of a thing, with this side of the face just all in darkness, and you just see this half in the light. Sometimes it's caught this way. It's a very interesting film. And of all things, Gene Kelly is in it as a mad killer. And there are extreme camera angles, high and low angles, and distortion. They're often twisted, what they call the Dutch angle. And they just create this very alternate world, a kind of a strange world to be in. Also, our film series talks about the production code and film noir. Film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the code. Lots of sex appeal in these films. The gender issues that were discussed, certainly women as femme fatales. And I mentioned this because, and mentioned it here, we were talking about the post-war thing, is what we have is pretty much, this is agreed upon by most film scholars, is the culture changed. The war altered our own culture. Women were working the factories. You know, you had, all the men were gone overseas. They were fighting. Somebody had to man the factories. And so women went to work. And then when the war was over, the men came back, and the women were supposed to go back in the home where they belonged, right? Well, the women just said, you know, I like this job. I'm not leaving it. And so you had a lot of assertive women as such. And the films began to reflect this in the sense that what we have are very assertive, if not outright aggressive, women as main characters who are dominating men, who get men to do their bidding. It sort of turned everything upside down in Hollywood at that time, when it just gave us this very assertive woman. So the summary is that film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality. Yes, very much so. It also talks about the modern mass American culture, the whole idea of consumerism, and also what we've got at this time is a disillusionment with Paradise Lost. So anyway, that's their phrase, and that's what they discuss. Okay, moving on. Okay, then we move into the film in the television age. So this would be the 1950s. This is the post-war decline in attendance. It's a very interesting phenomenon that occurred. In 1946, the war is over, all the men are back, and we have the highest attendance in ever. Even when we compare it with today, it's still, when you go back and you look statistically, 1946, there were more people going to the movies than ever. And in 1947, there were fewer people going to the movies. It just fell off a cliff. Now, nobody knows the reason why, other than there were other things here. One of them was the most obvious, is the threat of television. But television was not the only culprit. As our film series mentioned, there was suddenly more leisure time. You are now working the 40-hour week. There is more money. There is prosperity at the beginning of the post-war era. And there is interest in other activities, which I mentioned before, way back when we started, is the most popular kind of activity at this time was bowling. And there was migration to the suburbs. People were moving out of the city, getting away from the hubbub of the city, and moving to the suburbs. And so what we have there is you just don't have that ease of getting to the downtown theater. As a footnote here is, with that migration to the suburbs is when we have the sudden explosion of drive-in theaters everywhere. Okay, so with regard to television, and our little film series talks about the agreements between the motion picture industry and TV, and very basic what was in the beginnings. It's very simple. 3,000 miles separated television from movies. Television really originated in New York. Television was live, like a live show, a Broadway show. Film was not. Hollywood was not. And so very much what it was that Hollywood said, we don't want anything to do with TV. But TV had a very powerful impact on the economy, marketing. And so it was usually, even though Hollywood said we don't want anything to do with that, they could see how they could use that to market their films. And Walt Disney is usually considered the first person to see that potential, because he wanted money, needed money to build Disneyland. So he made a deal with ABC TV. He'd make a show for ABC TV in exchange for them paying him big money so he could make Disneyland. But what he discovered very quickly was that he could market his movies on television. Okay, now film in the television age, it's one of these things here. The movie industry has to respond to television, and it has to bring people out of the home and back to the theaters. And so their method at this point is the technical innovation. That's what's important to them, because if you've got a TV set with a very small screen, with a squawk box for sound, the theater can give you something better. They can give you the horizon-spanning widescreen and stereophonic sound, true high-fidelity sound. The first thing they gave all of us was 3D. You had to wear those little glasses. You went in there and you saw things coming at you. And that got kind of, people tired of that very quickly, when every time you went to a 3D movie, they were throwing everything they could think of at you. And then, let's see, that's how it worked. The cameras, the natural vision, how you saw all of that. And the first film was called Wanna Devil. in which you had a lion in your lap. A lion leaps right off the stage, or off the screen at you. And then they had the very wide, very extreme wide screen called Cinerama, which was so wide you could see images peripherally. And it was done by using 3 cameras at those angles like that to give you this huge wide screen that was in a kind of a semicircle, so that as you sat in the middle of this thing, you could see things out of the corner of your eye. And they also had the speakers everywhere, so you could hear sounds coming from throughout the auditorium. Then they settled down from that huge, wide, circular wide vision to just simply wide vision in front of you, which Fox promoted, which was called CinemaScope. It's called anamorphosis. It's an anamorphic squeeze. It was not new in the 50s. The man who created that lens had actually created that back in the silent era. And it's a lens that just takes a very wide image of everything, but squeezes it. And on your film, you get things like these characters here that are very tall and skinny and that sort of thing. And then you use the same lens and project it out onto the screen, and it gives you this very wide projected image. The aspect ratio of CinemaScope was roughly 2:1. It was Panavision that comes along, which replaces the CinemaScope, because they just had faster lenses, sharper lenses, and they promoted it by making their own movie, in which they called Panavision 35, because they had originally used it for a very wide film strip, 65 millimeter, and there was the normal one, and so Panavision took over. Also, they make a big deal about this, and it's still important, and that is the main thing is about what we see on TV when we look at those films, those widescreen films, because they're still works of art, and TV used to cut them up, panning and scanning and all of that sort of thing, so be familiar with that. They also gave us, they discovered there was a teenage market, so they made teen films, and also they brought us monsters throughout the 50s, which brought these young people into the theater. In the 1960s, the film school generation, we see this change that occurs. The production code changes. There's a lot more freedom in what you can show. I'm not going to go through all of these kinds of things, but you'll find it on the study guide, but you can see, what was going on at this time. The social political climate of the U.S., there was all kinds of university protests, the assassinations and the riots, and the women's lib, which led to the sexual revolution, which of course led to the loss of the production code, and to the point where everything goes. Pornography becomes legal. You go to theaters to see things that you never would have thought you'd see. And oh my gosh, I'm not going to go through all of those kinds of things. But you can find those on the study guide. And then we talk about later the new wave. This is the Cahiers du Cinema people. These film critics actually begin to make their films. We get into all kinds of theory. Films are now taken very seriously. We're talking the 1960s. And what you end up with is a study of films about the same way that people study books. The Edge of Hollywood, become familiar with modern filmmakers and examples of their works. And for our film series, the modern ones are Lucas, Spielberg, and so forth. And next, I'm not going to go through all of that. The new media, it changes. It's now a horizontal control. And that's about it. We're run out of time. So anyway, just remember the exam starts. If you're seeing this next week, it starts Thursday. If you're seeing it tonight, you got a week to go. That's it. See ya. Bye. Thanks. Hope you have a good summer. Boom.